Hello and welcome back for another VMK in the game development series. This VMK is going to be relatively short, but I wanted to show you how to accept command line parameter input so that you can bypass custom code inside of your game engine. You can also use this to pass values into your game engine before your game engine actually starts running. So let's see how this works. Our main entry point into our program is through WinMain here. So you can see we have WinMain, we set up our new text, we do all this work with the Windows parameters, and then we call create and call start message loop. Well, inside of WinMain we have a couple parameters, and we have an instance to ourselves, we have a previous instance which I don't think anyone uses anymore. We have the command line, and we also have a show command to determine whether we want our window to appear or not on the screen. This is all handled by the operating system whenever we run our program. The thing that we're interested in is this command line right here. What we're going to do is set up a breakpoint and just run our program. You'll notice that as soon as the program runs, we can go in and take a look at this value here. And right now it's null, so this thing hasn't been set to any values. This is basically the same thing as, let me just quit out of this. The way that this program is running right now is the same thing as if we were to go into our command line prompt here, and our game engine is called GameEngine.exe. That's the program we're compiling. If we were just to type in game engine like so, press enter, we'd have the exact same scenario that we do inside Visual Studio. Our game engine just goes and runs. 7 seconds later, it shows our actual screen. Well, what we want to do is add command line passes. So do something like this, -H for help, or maybe like -S for skip introduction, things like this. Right now, when we do that, nothing different happens because we don't handle those special keys while we're calling our program. But as a matter of fact, these extra command line parameters that we're passing in here, we can get using this variable right here. And inside Visual Studio, the way we pass parameters is as following. If we go under Project, Game Engine Properties, and click on Debugging, you'll notice that we have a command arguments section. So here, if we were to type in -H -S, for instance, hit OK, and then let's run a program, you'll notice now when we run, our command line value here has -H -S. Basically, whatever we typed in here under the properties got passed into this variable whenever our program got run. So that's basically the same thing as if we were to call a program this way, game engine -H -S. So we now have a mechanism for passing in these parameters through Visual Studio. Alright, knowing that, let's go and do something with these parameters. It's a little bit difficult to use this variable here because we need to go in and parse that string to extract each of those minus parameters. Like maybe we wanted to do one thing if we had -H, maybe we wanted to do something else if we had -S. Well, I already showed you how to parse strings, so you can go ahead and do that. But there's actually an easier way to handle the parsing technique, because Microsoft provides a function to convert the command line input that gets passed in to an array structure that's broken up for us to use. So let's take a look at how this works. I'll put it here at the very top. What we're going to do is create two variables, a double pointer to this thing called tchar, and an integer which is argc. Argv tells us this is a pointer to a pointer, which means this is actually an array of values. And this array is going to contain each of these parameters that we're passing into this command line here. Argc tells us how many of these parameters we have inside of this structure here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this function called getArgv command line. We're going to pass in the address of argc, and we're going to return argv to us. This function here, I'm just going to write right above the WinMain. We have the function returning a double pointer, and it's getting a pointer to an integer as an input. If we're using Unicode, then we need to call get command line W and we pass in argc. This function here already exists inside of the header file, so we don't need to worry about it. But if we're not using Unicode, then we can use the double underscore argc to get the argc value, and we can use the double underscore argv to get our argv value that we need to return. So either way, this will give us what we need. Now let's go and run the program and take a look at what this gives us. We see our command line is still -h -s, but now let's take a look at what argc is and argv is. Argc is set to 3. The reason why it's set to 3 is because it's counting how many different arguments were passed into the command line. The command line itself is comprised of the following: game engine, -h, and -s. So the parsing was done automatically for us, and the way it parsed it is it took this first thing, game engine, and dumped it inside argv, took this next thing, the -h, dumped it into argv, and took -s and dumped that into argv. And then when we count them, we have 1, 2, and 3 parameters. If we want to see those parameters, we can just go argv, and we see here we have an array, but our array we can't view directly like this, so instead let's do the following. If we take a look at the very first array, argv0, we see we have an e. If we take the next guy over, we have -h, and if we take the next guy over, we have -s. All the variables are stored for us automatically. Because this is a two-dimensional array, we can do things like 0, 0. So there's our E. Then we do 0, 1. There's our colon. Then we have 0, 2, slash. Basically, this is going to be storing our entire path information for the location of the first parameter. So our first parameter actually is E colon slash blah 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 all the way up to the very end here. Then we have -h, and then we have -s. So all of this is the first parameter, then we have second parameter, third parameter. And again, all of that is stored inside argv. So knowing that, we can now go in and write a couple logic statements in here to decide whether we want to do something special or not, depending on what was passed into our parameters. Let's do the following. Over here, I'm going to first create a variable, which is going to be a Boolean that's going to determine whether we want to skip our introduction or not. If we specify a parameter -s, then we're going to set this guy to be true so that later on we skip over it. If we have -h, we're going to display a help screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into a for loop. We're going to start at parameter number 1 rather than 0, and we're going to go up all the way to the end of the number of parameters we have. We can skip the first one, which is index 0, because we know that one is just going to contain the path information and the actual executable that we are running. Then we do a comparison. We compare to see whether the argv value here is equal to -h. If this is equal to 0, then that means we did find it. Or if we pass in /?. So this is the other string comparison we're going to check for. Either of these input parameters are going to give the same result, which will be, we're going to take in a string value here and type out OpenGL game engine. We're going to specify a version number, and then we're going to call message box, specify null as the first parameter, which means it's going to just display on top of the desktop. We're going to specify the string we want to display. We're going to specify the name of our game, which is defined up above, and then it's just going to have an OK button at the bottom and an information icon inside of this message box. If the parameter that we passed here is not either of these two, then we check to see if there's a minus sign. If there is not a minus sign, or the parameter argument here is less than 2, then that means it's an invalid switch, so we can just skip over it and continue on. However, if it is a minus sign, then we check to see if it's the character letter S. So Here we're checking index 0 for the minus. Here we're checking index 1 to see if it's an S. If it is an S, we're just going to skip over the introduction by setting that value to be true. And then we're going to go through all the arguments that were passed into us. Now I need to declare a couple variables here because we're missing some declarations. So we're going to go up into here and actually what I'm going to do is take all of this stuff and put it at the top. Right up here, just so it's obvious. So I'm going to specify the version number of our game engine is 1.0, and we have a text string that we're going to be using for our message. So here we're going to be specifying our text string like so, and we're passing in the version number. And after doing all of this, we just call exit 0 so that we don't actually run our game engine. We immediately quit. If we have our skip intro set to true, we're going to use that down below, but I'll talk about this in a second. So first, let's go and test to make sure that this works now. If I go into here and I type in game engine and I press enter, nothing different happens. The same thing, introductory screen, and then 7 seconds later we go into our game. Well, now if we go in here and type in /?, we see our game engine didn't start, and instead we get this message box. In the message box we have OpenGL game engine version 1.0. We can do the same thing with -h will give us the same message box. And if we were to type in something else, like maybe, I don't know, help, then we skip over that because we didn't know how to handle -help, and it just went into our regular mode of operation. So now let's go in and implement our code to handle this case, game engine -s. What we want to do here is use the variable skip intro to actually cause the game engine to not display the introductory screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this variable bSkipIntro and we're going to pass it into our start message loop. So we're going to call bSkipIntro right here. So doing this, we need to go into our start message loop, go into our declaration here, and let it accept the variable. And we'll go into the definition, specify it's going to accept the variable, and now we're going to use this variable down here. After we initialize, actually let me point this out first. Inside of the initialization, we go and do some work. If the work fails, then we're going to return. However, if it passes, then it's going to go down into here, and we're going to set the state of our game engine equal to starting. If it's starting, we automatically show that intro screen. If we change this to be play, then we don't show the introductory screen. Instead, we're directly inside of the playing mode of our game. So what we want to do is we want to check to see if our game engine is in this state. So let's go into start message loop. After initialize, we check to see if our game state now is equal to starting, and we want to skip the introduction. If that's the case, we want to bypass the introductory screen, and we do that just by setting the state of our game to be gs_play. So let's go and try this out. We can go in and compile this, and then when we go in here, if we run the game without any parameters, we see 2 seconds, flash, and then we can escape to show the game. But if we go in here and type -s, you notice immediately it skips the introduction and goes straight into the game mode. Now this is helpful because we can now use the command line to skip the introduction, but we also want to go in here under the project settings and specify -s here under the command arguments, so that from now on we don't have to see the introduction screen if we don't want to use it. If we're not working on the introduction screen, instead we're working on other parts of the game, let's just skip over the parts we know work and work directly with the parts that we're working with. So now inside Visual Studio we can go in and skip over the introduction immediately just by having that -s parameter in place. Okay, so there we go. Video is relatively short, but hopefully informative on how to use the command line so that you can pass in values into your game engine dynamically during runtime. During runtime, you basically have this command line value here that gets passed in, but I would recommend that you instead use the function here, getArgv command line, which will give you an easier way to handle the input parameters. Using this for loop, you check for the different parameters that the user can pass in. If it's a -h or a /?, just display a info message box here. You can change this to be whatever you want, maybe display the different values of switches that you accept, things like that. And then you have a switch case down here to handle all the different kinds of switches that you will be accepting. I've only overridden the S here to specify the skip introduction Boolean value, which we then went ahead and passed into our start message loop. Okay, so that's it for this video. Come back for the next video where I'll show you how to change the way that we handle the mouse input.